Is our discussion of principle number 17, which really goes with 16. Once you separate powers, what did the founders say you have to do? That's what we're going to talk about today. You can't just separate them, because they have to be not only separate, but they have to be coordinated. In other words, well, let me ask you this. Some people, when they finally caught on to a separation of power, separating these three great powers of government, make a law, enforce a law, and interpret a law, they finally caught on to that. Some of them actually went too far and said, oh yes, let's completely separate them. Well, what's wrong with that? Did you get that in your reading? I mean, if each of them has their own opinion and they don't work with each other, they don't coordinate with each other, everything is absolute. And you cannot keep this government moving properly. You've got to have a check and a balance between these powers. That's what we're going to talk about today. For example, let's say that the president had an absolute veto on the legislative. What does that mean, absolute veto? If he says, I don't agree with this bill, and vetoed it, that was it. It could never become law. What power then really have you given to the president? You've given, in a sense, lawmaking power, because he has the ultimate decision on what will become law or not. But the way the founders said, yes, he can express his opinion. But if the legislative branch still wants it and really wants it, can they still get it? Yes, because they can override his veto. You see that? This is an incredible genius of the Constitution, where the founders separated the power and then very carefully knit it all back together again so that there's a check and a balance. There's coordination between the three branches. It's incredible. It's beautiful. It's the only time such a thing has ever been done in the history of the world, and they figured it out. And others only wanted the branches to be subject to the checks of the other branch. So they had to really find a balance here. How are we going to coordinate between the two? Well, probably the best place to go to understand this doctrine of checks and balances as it relates to the separation of powers is in the Federalist Papers. And as you know, there are how many Federalist Papers? Do you know this? No? That's pretty close. There's about 85. And one of the persons who wrote most of them, well, wrote some of them, was James Madison. And James Madison wrote 5 of the Federalist Papers that dealt with this subject, checks and balances. Do you remember me telling you earlier on in this course that the founders believed that the three great powers of government, make a law, enforce a law, and interpret a law, if they're all in one person, what do you have? Tyranny. Do you think I just thought up that by myself? Listen to Madison, and then you'll see where I got that. I'm at 206, first quote there, which is Madison from Federalist Paper number 47. He says this: the accumulation of all powers, legislative, executive, and judiciary, in the same hands, whether of one, a few, or many, and whether hereditary, self-appointed, or elective, may justly be pronounced the very definition of tyranny. What's he saying? Isn't he saying just what I've told you before? Those three powers, all in one, is tyranny. That's Madison. His next quote there, going on, he says, the oracle, what's an oracle? A wise person, a person that speaks great wisdom to other people, okay? The oracle who is always consulted and cited on this subject, separation of powers and checks and balances, is the celebrated Montesquieu. if he be not the author of this invaluable precept in the science of politics, he has the merit, at least, of displaying and recommending it most effectually to the attention of mankind. What's he saying? If he didn't think it up, at least he's the one that put all the thinking together. Remember we talked about this yesterday? And said, somebody ought to put this to work. Remember in The Spirit of the Laws, he wrote Montesquieu. He learned from Polybius. He put it all together. He proved that it could work. And it was the founders then who came along and said, you know what, we're going to prove this. This is great thinking. 3 branches must coordinate. And they gave Montesquieu credit for that. He says at the top of 207, see that quote there, continuing in Federalist 48, I shall undertake to show, this is Madison still, that unless these departments be so far connected and blended, there's that word, blended, as to give each a constitutional control over the others, the degree of separation which is the maxim of Montesquieu requires, as essential to a free government, can never in practice be duly maintained. If you don't give checks on the other, to the other branches to check the power of one branch, it'll all fall apart. You cannot keep limited power assigned to each branch. Do you guys believe that? I mean, it's fine to separate power and give them power, but if that's all you do, it will eventually result in ruin, because you know what power does to people, right? They want to take on more power. Do you think the executive would ever like to make law? You think that? Oh, believe me. Do you think the judiciary would ever like to make law? Oh yes, see, this is what he's saying here. It's fine to separate the powers, but unless you put some checks into place, they'll be gobbling up each other's authority and each other's powers. We've seen that happen anyway, haven't we? Okay? So checks prevent the usurpation of power. All right, let's discuss some examples. You've observed the federal government today. And some of our checks and balances are inoperative because they're not being used. What has the failure to check produced? For example, a judiciary who does what? Well, it's supposed to interpret the law, but what's it doing? It's actually making law. Anybody give me an example? How was the judiciary making law? Let's go back to the early 70s. You know, in this country, up until that point, in the early 70s, the act of abortion was illegal. All of a sudden, the Supreme Court says, by a majority of 1 vote, in what famous case? Roe versus Wade. All of a sudden they say, it's a legal right. Now let me ask you something. If you're changing something from being illegal to being legal, who should do that? The legislature, who make law. That's a change of law, right? Guess what the Supreme Court did? They just said, it is now a constitutionally protected right of a woman to have an abortion. Did that change public policy? You bet it did. Did that change the law? Oh yes. Do you know that that issue has never been addressed by Congress? The lawmaking body, never been addressed.
So Congress is not doing their job.
Yeah. See? So this is a great example of the Supreme Court usurping power, and a check has not been activated or used to check their power. Are there checks? Yes. But if the people don't use them, this thing's going to get all messed up, which it has been. How else? Do you think the president ever makes law? Oh, yes. President loves to use what nowadays? Executive orders, and we'll talk a little more in detail about these. Executive orders, which the Supreme Court has said are just as valid as laws that the people must obey as laws passed by the legislature. What do you think? See, this is allowing the president to be a dictator. We'll give you some examples of that in a later lesson. So we have the president making laws. We have the federal government taking over some of the states' responsibilities. This Constitution was so balanced between the federal government and the states, but the federal government has now has now been taking over things that belong to the states. And unless there's somebody there to say, hey, wait a minute, you can't do that, you won't do that. See, we've been asleep at the wheel. And so they've been doing it. So when you hear the word government now, what do you normally think of? Federal government, Washington, D.C. Why don't you think of your city government, or your county government, or your state government? Because Washington is doing most of it. Have you noticed that? Founders would say, you got this thing way out of balance. Where are the checks and balances we put in so this wouldn't happen? Okay. And of course, high taxes on the people to keep all these services running from the federal government, right? Now, it's kind of interesting on page 209. It introduces you to a couple of ways that a check on government was tried. This is before the Constitution. Prior attempts to check power. And one of them was a council of censors. This was tried, as it says on page 209, in the state of Pennsylvania. What in the world is a council of censors? It really is a committee of citizens outside the government. And what they would do is look at government activity and perhaps declare it illegal or wrong. Well, what kind of power does this committee have? It doesn't have much. And so they soon found themselves powerless to help. So what if a committee says, government, you shouldn't be doing that? Who has the power? The government has the power, not this committee. Can't do that. At least it's not effective. So they said, no, we can't really do this. That's not a proper check. What does a check have to be good enough? It has to have what? It has to have power. It has to have political power. Right? So somebody said that in another arena, maybe we ought to have the vote of the people to check the government. Why is that cumbersome? Yeah, you're getting back to a democracy. You're going to ask the people to vote on every question? Actually, Madison addresses this again in the Federalist Papers. If you look on 209 down at the bottom. He says, the danger of disturbing the public tranquility by interesting too strongly the public passions is a still more serious objection against a frequent reference of constitutional questions to the decision of the whole society. What's he saying there? Yeah, well, he's saying don't go to the people very often because they get tired of you going. They've elected you to make the decisions. And they elect you on a very regular basis, periodically. How often? Every 2 years, maybe every 4 years, maybe every 6 years. It's a regular time. The people are prepared for it. But don't go to them and expect them to vote every other day on an issue. You'll find that very ineffective. See what he's saying here? It's disturbing the public tranquility because so many issues get to be so emotional. Right? You see what it is. We're in a campaign right now. Are they emotional? Oh yes, a lot of issues. Okay? So It's like an initiative and a referendum, which the founders would find objectionable. Don't take things to the people, except have them choose their representatives and let them do the normal business of government.